Well, thank you, Pierre. You were energetic as before. So now we have 30 minutes for questions. Pierre, one question I have is, and this around 5 years ago, we didn't know whether FAO number was right. We also didn't know whether the World Bank estimation is right. The FAO data shows that there was a peak of hunger. The World Bank also showed that more than 100, more than 100 million people went to the poverty because of the food prices. They claimed that they had the model, they had the household survey data. So the knowledge, true or reliable knowledge information that time was so critical. I mean, what we have learned from IFPRI is we needed to have our own data to track and monitor the progress through our country programs instead of using the World Bank or FAO, partly because politically driven. So I thought that was a missing piece just from our side. Okay, Claudia?
So
Will, I think you probably will touch.
Yeah, Claudia Ringler, IFPRI. A question that we keep getting asked is how much the wheat price spikes might have influenced the Arab Spring, Egypt, Tunisia, etc. And I don't recall if you had any of these countries in your study, and if yes, what would you say?
Thank you. Will.
Thank you. Per, thanks very much. Wonderful presentation. If I could just pick up on Schengen's point very briefly, I think there's a difference between the World Bank numbers, which were the partial effect of price changes on poverty, and the poverty monitoring numbers, which have come out later, and the estimates on hunger, which are a total effect of all of the things that are going on. So there's a subtle difference that's important to make. But Per, I had a question for you. Did you find many, and I think you probably did, cases where policies were actually operating in conflict? And I'm thinking of examples where maybe a country has put on an export restriction to push down prices that would have pushed prices way below where the government actually had in mind, and then had to buy up food to stop the price from going down. So you end up with something that's inefficient as a policy and potentially generates adverse externalities for the rest of the world. Did you find examples of that sort of policy?
Okay. Derek. A microphone, please.
Thanks very much, Per. I guess following the question on the Middle East, North Africa, I didn't. Yeah, the question is your selection of countries, and how did you go about it? Because I also noticed that the Russia, Ukraine, Kazakhstan went in there, and they were part of the problem in the whole food crisis. And then second, there are few countries that you rightly pointed out where domestic price volatility had nothing to do probably with world prices. And I'm wondering if you found any differences in behavior of governments in those countries. And I know, for example, I had the impression that Ethiopia was using the world food price situation to blame for the domestic price spike, which was really a domestic causes.
Okay, thank you, Pierre. You can start to tackle these questions.
Sure, thank you very much. Just one comment on Schengen, on your points. I was chairing the National Academy of Sciences committee to look at the perennial question of can the world feed itself by 2050 and beyond. And one of the issues we talked about was precisely the quality of data. What data can we rely on? And we concluded that we needed an agency in the world that would monitor whatever data could be obtained, that did not depend on its funding for showing the picture to be better or worse than it really was. There is a potential moral hazard or conflict of interest when an organization and I shall not mention FAO, of course, but when an organization can use data that may or may not be correct in order to draw more attention to itself and maybe more money. So what we were suggesting was that there be some kind of a construct that would be funded irrespective of whether the situation were getting worse, better, or indifferent. That has not happened, but I feel very strongly that there is a potential moral hazard here if an institution depends on money on the basis of how bad the situation can be shown, then that institution should not be generating data, in my opinion. Middle East, we only have data from Egypt, and Egypt has had riots every once in a while because of the large subsidies and removing of the subsidies and so on. So it's not clear to me or to any of our researchers, including our colleague from Egypt, that the particular global price increase had any effect on the overthrow of the president of Egypt. I can't really speak for the rest of the region because we don't have enough data. Yeah, there were several countries where policies were in conflict, and there were several countries where the policies resulted in probably at least as bad disasters as without the policies, maybe more. India now has 80 million tons of grain in stock. Half of it is outside. It is rotting at a very rapid rate. Zambia has huge amounts of corn in stock. It is rotting at a very rapid rate. If you don't believe me, I can show you pictures of it. Thailand has a mountain of rice they don't know what to do with. They won't release it to the market because that would push the rice prices down. And all of this happened because the governments decided to put a premium on the price of the particular commodity, whether we're talking about rice, wheat, or corn. So those were kind of policies that ended up in, I believe, what the governments didn't necessarily want. The specific conflicts in Bangladesh, as I recall, I have to go back and check the country studies, but as I recall in Bangladesh, they were kind of vacillating between buying something up for the reserve and releasing it, and I think there was a period of time when they were kind of doing both. So that there were those kinds of things going on, and there were ministries of agriculture who were working cross-purpose with Ministry of Finance in several countries. I have to go back and to the studies to see which one there were. Selection of countries, it was an art more than a science. We tried to get as much variation as we could. We had emphasis on sub-Saharan Africa for a number of reasons, which I would be glad to point out. And one reason was that the donor agency would like us to focus on Africa, but there were other reasons. Try to get as much diversity as we could, limit ourselves to those countries classified as developing countries, and that's probably all I can say on that. Did governments behave differently if the causes of the price volatility were internal versus external? Very good question. I'm going to go back and check the country studies to see if I can find an answer to that. But yeah, they certainly some of the countries blamed the international market, that's for sure. You need a strong man and you just find whoever you can, absolutely. But were the actual policies different? I have to go back and check that. I can't answer that. It's a good question.
All right, let's go to the second round. Mark, and there's one in the back. And David. Mark first.
Thank you. Mark Cohen from Oxfam America. Thanks for the presentation. I was sort of trying to think of it, let's say I was Manmohan Singh. I think my reaction would be, well, yes, I did what I had to do to stay in office. And if I hadn't stayed in office, then the BJP would have come in, which is much less favorable based on their record in office to smallholders than the Congress Party has been. So what would you have had me do? But also thinking about some other governments that took the advice from various quarters and totally liberalized their markets, like, say, Haiti. Well, I don't know if anybody remembers Jacques-Edouard Alexis, who was prime minister in April 2008. His political career is over. Precisely because of the factors you talked about. His opponents organized people to riot and burn tires, and that was the end of him. So I guess what ideally should a government like that of India, which is subject to periodic elections and has big cities full of people who vote and riot and things like that, what should they do?
Thank you, Mark. There's one in the back there.
Hello, Daniel Rothman. I was wondering if you could address the interaction of the policymakers with the commodities markets, particularly the futures markets, the role of speculators on the one hand, and the opportunities for policymakers to provide indirect and time-delayed price signals into markets through the commodities markets.
Yep. David, this side.
Yeah, David Orden, IFPRI. I've got two different questions. So my first one, Per, I'm going to address to you in particular as a neutral body, because I'm not very, I saw those two figures from FAO on the increase in malnutrition, the spike first, and then that smoother line at the presentation of the Global Food Report. And I read the chapter, but I haven't had a chance to dig any further into it than that. And I'm not even entirely sure what Schengen said about who played what role in those figures. And I'm not entirely satisfied with Will's sort of quasi-technical explanation of why one line is kind of smooth and one has a big price sharp jump. So from your perspective, what explains those early figures versus the later figures? And if I'm going to speak to a congressional staffer for some congressman or senator, and they're interested in this issue, what should I be saying? Should I be saying that price spike in 2008 didn't actually increase malnutrition in the world, and so maybe some of the rhetoric was overblown, and yet we still need increasing food supply to meet the growing demands for food? I mean, what should I say? Because that spike was a motivation for, I think, a boomlet of investment in the agricultural sector around the world. So that's my first question. My second question is on your this issue of whether outside influences should be trying to give policy advice or should be trying to support the governments. I think your words were support the governments in what they want to do. And I am sort of puzzled by your then saying, well, I think this is the way we want to go. We want to be supporting the governments what they want to do. So let's take the Philippines right now, trying to extend its TRQ, special exemption to have a TRQ for rice imports, and having quite a debate, let's say, with the World Bank, for example, about whether this is a good policy. The fact that they're, except in, I think, 2008, when for a very short time they had negative protection of rice. I mean, just a tiny little bit negative because their domestic price didn't go up as high as the world spike. I mean, other than that, they are heavily protecting rice, and consumers are paying, a very substantially higher price than they otherwise would. And the argument from some external forces is that this is not a good policy. This is raising poverty in the Philippines. So where do you draw the line between saying, oh, God, these governments want to do X, Y, and Z, and we should come in and support them, or when do we as analysts say we have some recommendations about policy that may not be what you're trying to do?
Well, thank you, David. Per.
Suppose I argue that Manmohan Singh's policy caused the Haiti problems. What would you say?
I'd say you're right, because that jacked up the price of rice for Haiti.
Exactly. So over a period of less than 8 months, the rice price tripled at a time when we had more rice globally than we ever had before. And it was to a very large extent caused by India putting export ban on, followed by Vietnam, followed by Cambodia, a little later on by other countries, linked up with speculation. That when the prices were going up that fast, there was a lot of money moving into the Chicago market for futures for grain. So my point, and imagine the Philippines buying rice from Thailand at $1,000 a ton, which they could have bought 8 months earlier for $330. And imagine what the Philippine government would have done if they hadn't subsidized all of that rice, talking about the Philippines. So my point is, if India or any other country signs an international agreement, they stick with it. Yeah, he may have lost his job, so what? There'll be another prime minister. I like Manmohan Singh. I think he's a great guy, but that's besides the point. You can't just sign an international convention or agreement, and then the first thing that goes wrong, you say, who cares? So that's my answer to that. Either we have some kind of a globalized world with some reasonable institutions, or we don't. And I'm not saying India is any worse than other countries, it's just that it's a big country and whatever they do has a tremendous impact. I don't have any information about the extent to which future markets are linked with the commodity market decisions in the study countries. It didn't come up for some reason. Obviously, the policymakers were paying close attention to what was happening in the futures market, but there was no indication that had any more influence than any other price information that they could get as they tried to make decision. David, I don't know, you didn't ask me that, I don't think, or maybe you did. I don't know which FAO data set is the correct one, or they may both be incorrect. They can't both be correct. Why did that spike occur? Again, I don't have evidence. My speculation, my guess is that it had something to do with that because that FAO felt something should be done about these rapidly increasing food prices, and let's just paint the worst picture we can come up with. I may well be wrong. I have no evidence. Don't take me to court, Mr. Secretary General of FAO, but that's the best I can do. Yes, the spike, of course, increased hunger, but it was location specific. It increased hunger in certain countries where they didn't compensate the losers, whereas in other countries it didn't. The problem with the spike was that it was kind of a global kind of thing, which turned out, I'm pretty sure, to be wrong. I'm pretty sure the spike is wrong. I'm much less sure about the current data from FAO that shows that we have done really well since 1990. I get suspicious when I see a horizontal line from 1990 to 2005. It jumps and it comes back, replaced with a line that is constantly decreasing. We're doing better and better and better every year. I have some real problems believing that, but then it may well be true. So what do we advise, or what do we do with the Philippine government when it's doing something we think is wrong? I think we should give them advice. We should share evidence, but we shouldn't strong arm them. After all, these guys are elected. At least in the Philippines, they're elected. So should we really go in there and say, sorry, we're going to take over, guys, and you don't get the next loan from the World Bank unless you do as we say? I have a real problem with that. Maybe that's why I don't work for the World Bank. Maybe it's because they never gave me an offer.
This is what the two FAO lines there, I also thought about a little bit. The first time when the FAO data came out, this is an estimation of $1 billion suffering from hunger. Obviously, immediately we detect some problem issues. That is, they applied some sort of price increase for every country. Immediately we realized that China and India's poverty or hungry numbers were overestimated.
Yeah, of course.
And I saw a big jump of hungry people in China and India. I said that couldn't be true. Sure. I came from China, I observed the rapid economic growth. Right. 2007, 2008, economy in China was growing at 10% per year. Meantime, we have seen like 20, 30 million more hungry people. So I think probably some sort of a universal price increase applied to every country without adjusting anything else. Exactly. That's one. Right. Then when they revise the data, I have seen that China, India have not shown increased hungry people. Now, whether the second line is right or more close to a reality is still questionable. Yes. Still questionable. Yes. One is ignore the other dimension of the malnutrition. That is the dietary quality, and look deeper into household allocation. So some of the data or some of the analysis we have seen from Afghanistan, from Pakistan, from Ethiopia, where we have two rounds of the data, one before the crisis, one after the crisis, right? So same household, we analyze what will be the impact on hunger, malnourishment. And we do see some very interesting results. The first is the women usually suffer more than men from higher food prices. Children probably also suffer a bit more. I mean, these are the concrete, probably ad hoc, localized household surveys. So I still think we needed to dig a bit deeper, particularly using actual household survey data. Look at other dimensions of malnutrition. So not using the simulation. Even the latest round of estimation is still from the simulation. So simulate the impact on number of hungry people, assuming certain household structure, assuming certain economic structure.
Can I just add to that, in addition to that, we have this very serious problem with the FAO data that they're only counting calories. They say nothing about nutrition. They're only counting dietary energy. Even if that's correct, there are many more people suffering from nutrient deficiencies, and there are many more people suffering from overweight, obesity, and chronic diseases. They don't deal with that. And that's not a criticism of FAO. It's just to recognize what it is we got. And it's not a number for malnutrition. Mm-hmm. It's a number, if it's correct, it's a number for the number. It's a measure of the number of people who don't get enough calories.
Let's go at another round. Yes, the front row.
You know, Per, after listening to you, I don't know whether to say I'm pessimistic or afraid. We have a projection that by the year 2050, there'll be 9 billion people.
Yes.
And everyone is talking about how do we solve the problem of food and water.
Right.
Do you think, therefore, that the institutional structure that we have now, internationally and locally or nationally, is sufficient or is very, very much in need of a revolutionary restructuring?
Okay. Any other questions? Yeah, there's one here in the front. Yep. Lynn.
Just a quick question. In all the countries that you studied, are there any good actors in this group, or should they all have been put in the sinner's bench?
Lynn, please.
Yeah, I want to come back on the FAO estimate, because I think what you said, Schengen, actually illustrates very well how we take one number and try to make it mean everything. And that number is so badly used. I mean, at the end of the day, it's basically a sort of poverty-adjusted food availability. It's only based on staple grains. It's only based on calories. But those two lines are not actually comparable because they're completely different methodologies. I mean, at the end of the day, the core food data comes from countries who have to report their grain production to FAO, and then FAO processes it. So in the second line, you have now an estimate for food losses, which was never in the first line. You also have a change of population figures because the population figures were reissued, so those were completely different. And I think the other thing is, to me, which is quite important, is FAO bases the calorie requirements for adults or adult equivalent on a sedentary lifestyle. Now, in the poorest rural agricultural countries, or even with poor urban populations, how many sedentary people do you have in that population? The answer is not an awful lot. And if you relax that assumption, the number back in the food price crisis, even on the new data, would actually be over 1 billion. So I think, you know, you have to think about what underpins it and what it means. And then even more importantly, that it's got nothing to do with nutrition, that people protect their calories, so therefore their nutrition actually bombs in a staple grain crisis. And the bigger picture is, what do we do now? The first crisis was really in the early 70s. What was the response of the agricultural research system to that crisis? It was, let's focus on staple grains. And we had a green revolution, which was great. But what happened to the price of fruits, vegetables, legumes, and livestock as a result, which is where a lot of the nutrition value is? And will our response to the 2008 crisis in ag research actually be the same again? Per?
Well, thank you. Per, I could also add another question. After 2007-2008 food crisis, now agriculture now is back on the development agenda.
Right.
And increased investment in agriculture research, in rural infrastructure, in some of the emerging economies, India, China, Brazil, or even including Africa. It is a bad thing. Without food crisis, would you think this increased investment would have happened?
I think that was a rhetorical question, was it? You should not be afraid. We can meet the demand of the 9 billion people by 2050 by increasing production by 1.3% per year. That's not much. That can be done. That can definitely be done if countries will follow, and I don't say that in jest, I really mean that seriously, if countries will follow the evidence and the recommendations coming out of IFPRI and other serious institutions. There is no reason in the world that we cannot feed 9 billion people by 2050 without doing irreversible damage to natural resources. That's my personal opinion. That's how I read the evidence. I may be wrong, but I won't be around in 2050, so you can't complain. At least I don't expect to. So, on a serious note, I don't think that's the problem. That's not the problem. The problem is so many people are malnourished in the true sense of malnourished. A lot of people are obese, becoming chronically ill. The problem is that we're not paying enough attention to sustainability and natural resource management. The problem is not that the planet is incapable of feeding future generations, in my humble opinion. Are there good actors? Absolutely. Almost all of them are good, depending on where you sit. And that's what the whole political economy discussion is really about. Which group benefits from what the governments do? Some groups are bound to benefit. It may be the government itself, but there'll be some groups benefiting. To those groups, the government, the decision makers are good guys. The question really is, what are the goals that the government is trying to pursue? Is it really maximizing economic growth in the most efficient way? Is it reducing poverty? Or is it to benefit certain select groups in society, which unfortunately seem to be the prevailing goal? So there are really good guys if you happen to be a member of the club that's going to benefit. No, we should clearly promote investment in agriculture, and that's why I said on a serious note that is what IFPRI is saying. Absolutely, investments in agriculture, research in infrastructure. I happen to think that right this moment, and Phil Party and others are going to kill me for saying this, but I think that right this moment in most of sub-Saharan Africa, the most binding constraint is poor infrastructure and poor domestic markets, not lack of appropriate technology. But if we don't do the ag research today, it will be lack of appropriate technology 10, 20 years from now. So we have to continue to invest in research, but unless we solve the infrastructure bottlenecks. Look, there are so many projects, and Mark knows these projects, and others do as well, I'm sure. So many projects that go into a community that they can help farmers triple the productivity per unit of land of corn, of sorghum, of whatever, and as soon as the project ends, if nothing is changed in the structure within which that farm operates, the farm goes right back to where it was before. So we know that with the current technology, productivity can be dramatically increased. What's constraining is outside the farm. And I gave a seminar here earlier, and you may recall that I made that same point because I think it's still relevant. So that if we can focus on these things, there is no problem feeding future generations, in my opinion.
Okay. Last round of the question. Okay, Rajo. And a hand from this side.
Yeah, thank you very much.
There's one in the back.
That was a fascinating presentation. I have two sets of questions for you. Several times in your presentation you alluded to media, but can you comment more on whether the role of the media was to escalate the crisis or help to dampen the crisis? I mean, did you find differential roles or similar roles in the countries that you looked at? And the second question I have for you is, this is one of the few studies, in fact, if not the only study I've seen. So what are some of the research questions or implications you take away from this for others who would want to do more work in the future? What should they be, what surprised you, or what you wish you could now have paid more attention to now that you begin to see the results coming out?
Thank you, Raju. Eugenio.
Thank you, Per, for the presentation. Very, very nice, excellent presentation as usual. Now, comment related to the, we have the long-term the cycles and then the spikes. I was representing the Haitian government at the time. Mark knows that will too. The president of Haiti at that time was President Preval. He was an agricultural engineer. So when the spike came, he said, high prices are good for agricultural sector, and I can do much about that. And then reporter told him, but you have people on the streets protesting against the high prices. So President Preval said, okay, I can go and protest with them too, because we cannot do anything about high prices. So suddenly you had a huge throng of people banging at the palace, telling, come and join us. So the UN Blue Helmet had to save President Preval from that. So basically you are in a situation in which you need to react immediately. And as I said, one of the main policy mistakes that you can make is to get yourself hung from a lamppost. So you need to react immediately to that. First point. Second point, these spikes cannot be solved. The policy advice has to be incentive compatible with the situation that they are facing. The WTO for these spikes is too slow. I had the experience of, talking to some people in the US government that they needed to get some votes from Senator X or Congressman Y, and they passed something that was completely WTO illegal. And we told them, but you know that this is WTO illegal, and we will take you to the WTO. And the people from the US government said, take us to the WTO. It took 2 years, and eventually they changed whatever was the problem at that time. But then it's too slow to deal. My point is the WTO is too slow to deal with spikes. So we need something that is quicker. Maybe the export ban disciplines that you mentioned as part of the WTO. But eventually you will need something that works faster and is incentive compatible with the situation that the governments are facing. Thank you.
Okay, here this time I'm not going to add my question to you, to your list. Only two, from Raju and from Eugenio.
Okay. It's a very interesting question, Rajul. And if I can first talk about the role of media in the study countries, that role varied tremendously, as you can imagine, depending on how open the country was. In some countries, the media basically said what the government wanted it to say, and we can think of some countries where that would be the case, like Vietnam and China to some extent, I suspect still. In other countries, it was wide open, and the media did participate. In some cases, the national media amplified the price fluctuation, amplified the perception, in the sense that they were telling those who were listening or reading that the price situation was worse, was going to get a lot worse than it actually did. But if I can talk about the international media, it's much clearer at the international level. There, the news media really caused some harm. Even today, you have news media that claims that the food prices have continued to go up since 2005, totally ignoring the fact that prices have fluctuated. The media, beginning at the end of 2007, when the prices had gone up for a while, the media jumped on this and exaggerating the price increases beyond reason. When prices then began to fall, around, depending on the commodities, between February and June of 2008, the news media said nothing, not a word. Then when prices began to come back up, some of the media was right back there, saying, you see, we told you. That was just a temporary reduction in prices, but in fact we were right all the time. Prices are going to keep going up. The worst part of the media is the blog. The blogs, and apparently they have no responsibility to anybody. The blogs were extreme, absolutely extreme, And I don't know if Maximo or Klaus are here, but I guess they're both out. They've been following that, and others probably have worked with them on that. So you can bear me out on this. But so I think that the media, while it is extremely important in informing the decision makers and others, it has a responsibility, and I don't think it lived up to it, certainly not at the international level. The Haiti situation, as I understand it, what I'm hearing is a justification for making the policy decisions that those countries did. The people are on the street, they are tearing up the place. You got to do something, you got to do it now. You can't wait for WTO to tell you something 2 years from now. Absolutely correctly. And it seems to me that where we need to focus with our future research, and I think that was another thing you raised, Raju, is how do we prevent these kind of spikes? Because the spike in 07, 08 was not made by nature, it was made by humans. It was a spike that we didn't have to have. So it seems to me we need a lot more research on how to avoid these kinds of spikes. Yeah, if we get hit with a big meteor and nobody can produce any food whatsoever for 2 years, we got a problem. We got a serious problem that we didn't make, right? Unless we failed to stop the meteor. But what happened in 07, 08 was really not a natural thing. We had loads of food. So it seems to me that's really where we need to focus. When we get to the point that Haiti was, I agree that you break all your international agreements and you do what you have to do, but I want to come back and say if you sign an international agreement, whether you are a big country like India and China, you're a small country like Haiti, if you stick to those agreements, it's much less likely that the Haitian Prime Minister would have to make those decisions. By the way, I understand that most of the demonstration in Haiti was not about food prices, it was about drug trade. But that's another whole story.
Well, thank you very much, Pierre. Well, clearly I learned a lot from what you just said. I'm not going to summarize what you have said, and I'm not going to repeat what I'm going to say in your book. You can access all these briefs from the UN wider website. And this I have learned probably 3 or 4 points from Pierre's presentation and the discussion. Number one is the data. We do need to improve the data. Connect the data on time to select the right indicators going beyond calories, nutrition. So we are working with FAO, we are pushing FAO to connect more nutrition health data. And also use household survey data, more household survey, not from simulation, not from sort of assumed structure from which it was probably derived many years ago, because the economy, household structure have changed dramatically for the last decade or so. The data is number one. Number two is the political process. Yes, we needed to understand more and to work more on that. To make the political process work for the poor, I think it is very important to have the knowledge, research-based knowledge, and how different policies, different events would affect poor people, hungry people. And to communicate that knowledge to the citizens, so the citizen can drive the whole political process. Yeah, Mohammed Hussein is making the decisions, but he makes a decision based on his political calculation. From where? Well, his constituents are smallholders, are consumers. If the smallholders know this knowledge and this information, then the smallholder consumers will push the political system for him to make the right decision. So right now, I do see a gap there. The smallholders, general citizens, do not have the right information, right knowledge, or reliable information. And as a research institute like IFPRI, I think we should generate this reliable, neutral information and empower the political constituents. The third is is a capacity building. I think David Olden said, should we just let the country decide what they should do? Yes, of course. But they need their capacity. They need a strong capacity to drive to develop, to own their own agenda. So capacity building is very critical. So lastly, I think it's not to the higher level. It's a volatility of the food prices that affects poor people. Poor consumers don't know tomorrow's price. When they face risk, when they face uncertainty, they will not make economically viable decisions. Most likely they are very risk averse. And the consumers obviously also cannot predict their future consumption. So they cannot make the right decision in allocating their household budget to cover children's education, health, or other more productive spending. So how can we really work on to reduce the price volatility, not necessarily reduce the price level, will be a very critical research topic. So for that, Per, I thank you so much. Once again, let's give Per a big round of applause. Thank you.